Hello and welcome once again to On the Go with the Glenn Advantage team. I am Marsha Glenn, your host, and today I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to someone you may very well know already, and we are thrilled to be able to have David Cay Johnston on the podcast with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. So you'll have to bear with me as I go through lists of achievements and accolades for you, which are a couple pages worth. So let me expound on all the things that you have achieved and you have done. I think it's well deserved to be listened to. David is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and a best-selling author. Because of the importance and depth of the crimes, misdeeds, and inequities his work has uncovered, the Portland Oregonian said his work equals that of the original muckrakers Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, and Lincoln Staffens. His work prompted the only major tax policy change by President George W. Bush administration. Johnston was also the first national journalist to criticize President Obama's failure to fulfill his promise of transparency, followed and confirmed by others. Author of 9 books, different languages.
Well, 8 books, 1 soon.
Oh, okay. So I'm going with the 9 because we got 1 soon. Several of which are bestsellers, obviously. He has written a trilogy on the American economy and several books on Donald Trump. Now,
another trilogy on Donald and then half of a 4th book.
Okay. He is now a professor of practice at Rochester Institute of Technology, teaching law, public policy, and journalism. He is a frequent guest on CNN, MS Now, several overseas outlets, and local radio. He is a co-founder of DC Reports.
Report,
singular. A not-for-profit service that provides reporting, information, and perspective on the policies, politics, and events that affect everyday lives and futures. So, I have to ask, what in the world do you do with your free time?
Yeah, at my age, I'm 77, working more than full-time. I carry, by choice, a 2/3 heavier load than my contract requires at the university, and working on books, I work a lot.
Proven.
So
absolutely proven and absolutely needed in terms of the information that you have gotten out to the public over the years. So I thank you for that contribution for sure. So tell me, I'm very interested, what got you into investigative journalism? What was that passion?
I originally, it's in my junior high school yearbook in Santa Cruz, California, was going to join the LAPD with the expectation I would make the robbery homicide squad at a young age and go to law school and become a prosecutor and maybe DA of LA County. And I actually applied to be what's called a khaki officer. Basically, you work as a clerk, and then if they like you, they put you in the police academy. And then when I was 18 years old, I had just graduated from high school, and I was reporting for 2 shopper newspapers, that every door gets, whether you subscribe or not. I was recruited by the San Jose Mercury. My stories, I'm untrained, so I did things my own way, were getting attention. One morning, turned on the radio in the car, and the NBC station in San Francisco is reading one of my stories over the air and going, "Why isn't this in the Chronicle in San Francisco? Why is this in the what is this called? The County News in Aptos? Where's Aptos? That's south of Santa Cruz." And anyway, the Mercury, they had a great time making fun of me for an hour, but I went back every 3 weeks, and the next job opening they had, they hired me when I was 19. And I made the front page in less than 2 months and spent almost 5 years there.
Wow.
I was still the youngest reporter when I left.
That's fabulous. That's a great story. That's proven you were meant to be where you are.
I didn't completely give up on the homicide detective. I solved a number of murders in my career. And a lot of other crimes as people have gone to prison for, in some cases for such long terms that they died behind bars.
Oh, yeah, that's sad.
So, yeah, very sad for them.
Well, also sad for the folks who are behind bars and then get let out 25 years later, proven innocent.
Yeah.
Also very sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Donald Trump is morally unfit for office of POTUS. In 2016, Michael Russell, writing for the Herald Scotland, wrote of the making of Donald Trump. If even a tenth of David Cay Johnston's stories are true, then Trump is morally, intellectually, culturally, economically, legally, and politically unfit for office of any sort. Since then, criminal court has found Trump guilty on 34 felony counts, liable for sexually abusing a woman in a department store, and defamation. Trump is repeatedly mentioned in the Epstein files. And let's not forget the poignant picture of Trump at the dignified transfer ceremony at Dover Air Force Base, where our commander-in-chief is wearing a USA baseball cap. Anything you want to expound on?
Well, I think it's important for viewers to know that I've been covering Donald since 1988. I wrote about him becoming president in July of 1988, the first person to do so. He has hired repeatedly really, really excellent lawyers, very expensive lawyers to come after me. And he's yet to show a single error in any of my work. The first time Donald told me he was going to sue me, I just looked at him and said, well, Donald, if you think you have a case, you should bring it. It will be interesting that I'll get to question you under oath. And, well, he has complained that he calls me the weird dude, complains, about my work. He's never been able to show anything. So the reviewer, rhetorical device of even 10%, everything in that book is true, including where I make it very clear that Donald was in the cocaine trafficking business with a guy named Joe Wexelbaum. He did extraordinary favors for Joe that make absolutely no sense unless they were in the cocaine business together. Joe was one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in America, and Donald should have had nothing to do with him, but they were entangled like a ball of yarn a cat's taken apart, completely entangled with each other. And Donald is the third generation head of a 4-generation white-collar crime family. In fact, in the fall, I'm going to teach a class for seniors and graduate students on white-collar crime. There are many white-collar crime families in America. We devote most of our law enforcement resources to street crime, which has been falling tremendously. Best example of that, in 1980, I was assigned by the LA Times to investigate the LAPD. I was the first journalist to systematically examine the LAPD. And I ruined their reputation as the most honest, efficient, effective police department in the world with their own data and their own police reports. And at that year, there were 1,024 homicides in LA with a population of 3 million. Today, the city has a population of 4 million, so it's bigger. And there were about 232 homicides last year. So there's been an 85% reduction. And all across the country, that's what we're seeing with reported murders, rapes, arson, grand theft auto, great bodily, aggravated assault. Tremendous decline in that kind of crime. But we're seeing a huge increase in the kind of crime the Trumps and the Trump-Kushner family commit, where they steal from you with broken promises, with refusals to pay, with contracts that have subtle escape language in them. They cheat workers, investors, business partners, and governments across the board, and that's one of the reasons they have a lot of money.
So the crimes that most people think are exciting things to learn about are the criminals on the streets with the robberies and the carjackings and the murders and all of that. And everyone wants to run and read about that and be aghast at what that means to us who live in those communities, without thinking that the highest percentage of crime is indeed all of that white collar.
Well, I don't know if it's a percentage, but the economic damage from white collar crime, various studies have shown, is between 10 and 20 times the economic damage from street crime. Now, I don't mean to diminish the significance of any murder, any rape, any robbery, but we should recognize that there's been less of this. I think going forward, there will be less of this unless we go into a serious economic collapse, in which case all bets are off. And the reasons are that, first of all, we have lots of surveillance cameras now all over the place. In the city of Rochester, we had, I think it was the second city in the country to get a sound detection system. You fire off a gun, the police virtually instantly know where the shot was fired, what caliber the weapon was.
Wow.
And a number of cities now have these systems. We have DNA evidence that we didn't used to have. And so I think there'll be a likely continued decline in traditional street crime. But until people recognize that we're misallocating resources, we will continue to run a system that actually operates to benefit and help white-collar criminals. And let me point out that as president in his second term, Trump has repeatedly granted pardons to very major league drug traffickers, including one man, 400 tons of cocaine. Trump let him go. Including sexual predators, a number of people who assaulted children among that group, and all sorts of white-collar thieves, some of whom are now going to get to keep their fortunes instead of paying it out to the people whose pockets they completely drained. And that's because of who Donald is. In fact, I call him a pro-criminal president. You just have to be his kind of criminal. And he is very clearly selling clemency and pardons. If a president grants you clemency under the Constitution, you have to leave the prison you're in. You don't get to stay. If it's a pardon, your acceptance of a pardon under a 1925 Supreme Court case known as Burdick is an admission by you that you were guilty, that you committed offenses against the United States. So there are people, Burdick being the first famous case, who refuse pardons because it means you're guilty. Trump says that's nonsense when it's convenient, and he says, of course you're admitting you're guilty when it's convenient. But he has reduced radically the capacity of the FBI to go after domestic crimes. He has prompted the resignations of many experienced criminal prosecutors at the federal level, and he is running a pro-criminal administration.
Well, most certainly it seems like things are being dismantled on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah.
That are going to end up having a trickle down to affect all of us that are living within this country and essentially across the world, well, in many aspects.
Marsha, the second book in my Trump trilogy, the first one was The Making of Donald Trump. That's the one that tells you about, among other things, Joe Wexelbaum and the drug trafficking. The second book in the trilogy, it's even worse than you think, was about the efforts to dismantle and destroy the federal government as we've known it. And The Atlantic famously ran in October of 24 a cover image of Donald Trump on a hearse in Washington being burned to the ground. And they announced in the 2016 campaign that their intention was to, as Steve Bannon put it, deconstruct the administrative state, which is just highfalutin language for we're going to burn Washington and the federal government to the ground. And that's because Donald Trump is all about one thing. He's about Donald. He's not about the people who support him in MAGA. He's not about peace. He's not about war. He's about Donald. He believes he's special. He believes, I said way back in 2011, if Donald ever gets to the White House, he will never leave peacefully. I was mocked by some people back then for that. Well, lo and behold, look what happened in 2021. And the only time in his life Donald has ever said, when he was asked, tell us about mistakes you've made, he gave a very interesting answer. He was asked in 2016 by a local radio talk show host, Bob Lonsberry, as a Christian, Mr. Trump, when's the last time you asked God for forgiveness? And there's this pause, and then Trump says, ask God for forgiveness? I mean, why would I do that? I've never done anything in my life that requires asking forgiveness, which should scream to people that this is all a facade. Well, in 2024, he told The Atlantic magazine, I run the country and the whole world.
Yes.
And just weeks after he returned to office in 2025, just weeks after returning to office, he declared himself our dictator. And I wrote about it and made a video about it right on the spot when he said that. And he repeatedly argues, I have an Article 2 in our Constitution, an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. People should read the article. It's not very long, but I'll summarize it for you. The President of the United States is the errand boy of Congress who will do whatever Congress tells him to do, and he is to execute what Congress wants, and he's Commander-in-Chief of the military. That's it. We grant way too much authority to presidents, and we treat them as if they're temporary kings in some ways, and that was not the scheme of the framers of our Constitution, are not the same as the founders of the country. The framers of the Constitution clearly intended that the legislative branch, well, they are all equal, would be the dominant branch. It would raise money. It would say where we're going to spend money, and it would direct the president to do its bidding. It's not the job of Congress to do the bidding of the president.
There are so many people, though, within our country that do not necessarily get their information from the appropriate places, or the entire amount of information needed in order to come up with a rational decision-making process that would give you some kind of clarity in terms of where we are going. And that's kind of, how do we take care of that?
Well, Marcia, we've always had a problem with democracy. In the beginning of the Republic, we strictly limited the vote. You basically had to be a white male property owner. Voting was held on Tuesdays so that bosses could make sure their workers didn't go vote unless they were confident they were going to vote the way they wanted. We slowly, over a long period of time, have expanded the franchise, first to black men, though not generally in the South, to women in the 1920s. And we've seen a very active campaign now for about 50 years by the Republican Party to restrict the franchise, to reduce the number of people who vote. And then we have apathy. Every single presidential election since 1788, the winner didn't care to vote. And we should keep that in mind. Large numbers of people do not feel connected to our democracy. In recent years, what we've seen is millions of people have been persuaded that people like me, we just lie to you. We're just paid to lie to you. Reporters who go out, as I've done, and solve crimes, get criminals arrested, reveal wrongdoing, all of which we can be sued for unless we are very precisely correct in what we report. There are all sorts of people who are convinced that we just make this stuff up. And the amazing part of that is that the people pushing this make stuff up, Donald in particular. You cannot have a democracy without a populace that has a set of facts to make good decisions from. The framers of our Constitution, most of whom were not signers of the Declaration of Independence, they were very clear about their concerns that the rabble, as was said in the day, not be inflamed with passions that would lead them to make bad choices. That's why we have all these checks and balances in the Constitution, partly to control any excesses by the executive. That was a major concern. But also to allow for change, but to require a lot of heavy lifting to do it, to ensure, hopefully, that we didn't make bad changes. And we've made some dumb mistakes. I think prohibition is widely accepted now to have been a huge mistake that encouraged criminal operations to arise. And so we have a lot of people who they believe what Donald tells them is the truth. In fact, it's the received truth. The capital T, as the semanticists and linguists and sociologists would say, as opposed to facts we can argue about. And Donald, of course, tries very hard to make sure that you don't understand the facts, or he muddies clear waters with his assertions, because in all dictatorial societies, and we are now a dictatorship, not fully consolidated, but we are in a dictatorship, those in power benefit when people are confused and when people don't have the facts.
So what I found to be extraordinary, The Big Cheat,
The third book.
the third book, where you went through and basically laid out where Donald came from, which was kind of real estate in New York failed, businesses, casinos failed, businesses, the reality TV show, which in and of itself, one would think, if you step back and took a look at most of our presidents in history, one would not have necessarily accepted all of the things that he represented as being someone who should be put into that kind of power. But a vast majority of the population obviously saw what, themselves?
No, vast majority
What?
did not. First
Okay,
of all,
so-
he lost the popular vote in 2016 and 2020.
Right.
And he got less than half the vote in 2024. He won by one of the narrowest margins we've ever had over a candidate who was thrown up at the last minute and wasn't a particularly attractive or good candidate, even though she's very well qualified to run government operations. Donald essentially was able to build three base elements to support him. The biggest of this group is people who are economically hurting. The 90% of Americans' incomes peaked in 1973, which was also the peak year for union membership in the private sector. By 2016, when you adjust for inflation, the bottom 90% only got, compared to 1973, in 2016, they only got paid through Thanksgiving. They basically went all of December and a little more with no income. Now, you don't know that because but people like me go and dig into all this data, and you get a pay raise and there's inflation, and people as they get older often make more money because they are more valuable. Mm-hmm. But the 90% of Americans were worse off by essentially a month's income. But then there was another change. In 1973, if you had a pension, and more than half of workers, or about half of workers did, that was on top of your pay. Now you save out of your cash pay in a 401k and get a little match from your employer. Healthcare, which the vast majority of workers of companies of any size had, was on top of your pay. And now a large segment of your health insurance comes out of your cash pay. So when you run the numbers on this, essentially in 2016, the 90% only got paid through Halloween. They went 2 whole months with no income. Now, all they know is, I don't have enough money.
Right.
And so we have this new measure of poverty that the United Way movement came up with called ALICE. Asset limited, as they don't have any savings. Mm-hmm. Income constrained, they're not making very good salary. Employed. So they work, but they don't have assets, and they're not paid enough to make ends meet. And for people in the bottom 50%, this is terrifying. There's a great deal of uncertainty. When I graduated from high school in 1967, there were jobs plentiful all over the place. This continued to be true until around the late 70s. And a whole series of election choices by voters have made this worse. That's what my economic trilogy, Perfectly Legal on Taxes, Free Lunch on Subsidies to Companies that nobody knew about at the time, and the fine print about reducing competition and promoting monopolies and oligopolies, laid out to people, and did so in a way that if you finished high school, you should be able to understand the books. And you have this vast majority who've gone from prosperity to living paycheck to paycheck, being very vulnerable to any unexpected economic shock, losing your job, your spouse gets sick, you have a kid who has a huge medical bill, the transmission falls out of your car. And all of that's because of these government policies that I documented in that book, including things like enabling many super wealthy people to live effectively tax-free by borrowing against their assets. If you got $300 million, you can stop paying taxes for the rest of your life if you know what you're doing and it's not difficult. Secondly, getting rid of unions. When 37% of private sector workers were in unions, 80% of workers benefited. Many employers were happy to pay the union wage rate. They just want the union rules. Well, as you get rid of unions, it pushes down everybody's wages. Captains of jumbo jets in the late 70s, in today's dollars, made over $1 million a year. They don't make anything like that anymore.
Right.
Then you have the second group, and that's what I call faux or fake Christians. People have no idea what's in the New Testament. They're from Donald's school of, I want to hit them in the face. And Donald has said when he was at the National Prayer Breakfast during his last year of his first term, where the main speaker got up and talked about the Sermon on the Mount and turning the other cheek, and Trump got up and said, I can't do that. And he pushes revenge. And if there's anything explicitly rejected in the New Testament, it's revenge. But we have a whole country full of people who think that Christianity is about getting rich, turning away the stranger, punishing the poor for being poor, letting children starve, not caring if you get thrown in the dungeon. This is completely at odds with the New Testament, but ardent believers are everywhere. The third group are those who hate the civil rights movement. They're the ones who would go around saying, oh yeah, you have to speak in a politically correct way. Yeah, good manners are a good thing to have, and using racial slurs and gendered slurs and the like, those are, at the very minimum, they indicate, you don't have good manners. You're not a civil human being. Now, these three, and the way I usually describe that is people who don't want to sit next to a black person on the airplane, don't want to have an Asian flight attendant, and God forbid there's a black woman in the captain's chair of that airplane. It just drives them crazy. By the way, if I get on a plane and there's a black woman captain, my attitude is, I'm on a really safe flight today because you had to go through all sorts of things designed to keep you from getting there. So you must be really damn good. But these three factors overlap. The 90% income-wise who are worse off, the people who call themselves Christians and believe anti-Christian and promote anti-Christian views, and people who hate the civil rights, women's rights, gay rights movements. A lot of overlap there. But Donald built out of that this coalition of the angry. And you know what? My books are about, you should be angry in the economic terms about what's happened to you. But what you need to recognize is people like Donald Trump, through the laws they're getting passed, are making you worse off. I mean, we are under Donald Trump's one big beautiful bill and his 2017 tax bill, literally borrowing over the next 30 years more than $30 trillion, doubling the federal debt, just to give tax relief to the wealthiest and most prosperous people in America. That makes no sense whatsoever, to borrow money so that people who already have more than enough have more. And concomitant with this is the stuff I've exposed about corporations. Many companies only appear to pay income taxes. That is, if you look at their financial disclosures, it'll show federal income tax paid. It's actually federal income tax accrued, that is, that you owe. But many companies have tricks that I've described that allow them to earn a profit this year. Let's say they own $1 billion in taxes this year. They don't pay any of it to the government. They invest that money for 30 years. That $1 billion inflation adjusted is now $3 billion. They then pay the $1 billion they owed, and they're ahead by $2 billion inflation adjusted dollars. And you pay for that. You pay for it. You don't see it. It's not obvious if you don't read my books. And I know that it's hard for people to understand accounting and things like this. But the Trump administration, following on the George W. Bush and Reagan administrations, is actively picking your pocket and transferring money through all sorts of stealth mechanisms that my books describe to people at the top. And these are stealth tax and spending and subsidy policies that I teach now to the students in various classes that are really just destroying the country, the fabric of the country. They're causing a lot of people to say, as Trump said the other day, a lot of people think we should have a dictatorship. I think it might be a good idea. We should have a dictatorship. The country needs it. No, what we need is government policies that benefit the vast majority of people the exact point made by Adam Smith 250 years ago when he figured out market economics and created the understanding we have in the modern world of how business works, how capitalism should work. We don't need a dictator. We just need government policies that make the majority of us better off, not worse off.
That would be wonderful to be able to achieve. And tell me in regards to, I know that I think it was as of today or late yesterday, U.S. Treasury has now become insolvent.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
No. First of all, the U.S. government cannot go bankrupt.
Okay.
Because under the Constitution, Congress has monopoly on currency. Now, the government can make us go bankrupt, but the U.S. government can never go bankrupt. And to somebody who's listening and saying, oh, well, I got some Russian rubles for you, the Russian government that issued rubles back before the Tsarists were defeated doesn't exist anymore. If we destroy the U.S. government, then you can have a complete wipeout. But so long as the United States of America exists, no matter how much Congress spends, our government cannot go bankrupt.
Good. I'm glad that was put to the forefront because I know folks are probably reading that in some fashion, and everyone's hair is turned on fire again.
Yeah. Trump now is out saying, I don't know if the gold is in Fort Knox. We should go look. He's not going to go look. All he wants to do is create uncertainty and hatred of government, even though it's government that makes all of our liberties and our freedoms possible.
So the Financial Times wrote of the same book, if Johnston's rendering of Trump is at all accurate, it is not just Trump who deserves rebuke. So too does an entire American political system that has put him within reach of the White House despite his manifest flaws. Republicans are loath to stand up against for fear of being called out publicly, God forbid, that they should get labeled with a name of some sort, or be primaried. The Democratic leadership, in spite of itself, can't seem to get much more passionate, let's say, than Grandpa winning his first place prize in the harvest contest. There are some Democrats who are trying to break through right now, which gives us some hope. Some of the noise is kind of being put aside, but there is so much chaos every day that it's hard for the public to pay attention. We've got Epstein files on the left, and we've got the Iran war on the right. So how do we counteract that right now?
Well, I think you have people across the spectrum who are troubled both about the Epstein files and about the war in Iran, which only Congress has the power to declare war, and a president only has the authority to take military action when there's an imminent threat. And Trump's own administration has now made clear there was no imminent threat, and we knew that. That's part of his dictatorship. I have an article, too, that says I can do anything I want, which is one of the lies he tells. We got here in large part because of the economic issues I just talked about. But we've seen the weakening of party structures over time. The Republicans have become very good at organizing and developing bench strength and electing people at every level of government, from mosquito abatement district to school board to town councils and city councils. The Democrats have not been paying attention to their knitting. The loss of large union support, which did a lot of the heavy lifting for that, getting people organized, informing people, has been devastating to the Democrats. The Democrats also cannot seem to grasp that the 30 million households in America that have a side business or a small business of some kind, almost all of them either just the person, husband or wife running the business, maybe the spouse, and having no assets or very few assets. Those are people who are not part of the business class that the Republican Party has always identified with. They are a natural constituency. The person who runs the shoe repair shop you go to, who probably works like a dog for $40,000 a year, but at least they're their own boss, it should be naturally inclined towards the Democrats. The Democrats don't seem to be able to learn how to market. The Republicans have 12 big organizations in Washington that I call the Madison Avenue of ideology, or ideological marketing organizations. So when I was a boy and a teenager, there was a British company that said to young men, if you buy Brill cream and put it in your hair, girls will be all over you. There may be stupider ideas, but you know what? That company sold a fortune of Brill cream, and they're still around. And the same thing applies to, ads for beer and dresses and all sorts of things. People can be moved with advertising in terms of how they see themselves in society. And so the Democrats are confronted by the death tax. And back in 2000, 2001, when I was with the New York Times, I interviewed unbelievable numbers of people who had nothing, who were convinced that the government would come in when they died and take half of what they had. And I would tell them, no, the first, at the time, I think it was $700,000 that you had was not subject to tax. It's now $13.3 million. And I'd go, so yeah, you and your wife, you got $1.4 million. Well, no. And I said, then you don't have anything to worry about. No, I just heard Rush Limbaugh just said they take half of everything when you die. And I went, and you believe him? I mean, why would you? Well, he's very popular. He doesn't know anything, and he doesn't care about the truth. And so we have this terrible disconnect by people from what's happening. And part of that is there's been a campaign all the way back to a man named Reed Irvine and Accuracy in Media that began in the 1960s, just attacking honest journalism. Because if you want to have a dictatorial regime, you can't have honest journalism. When the lawyer Lewis Powell from Richmond, Virginia, a really first-rate lawyer, very conservative guy, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce called the Powell Memo. I think everybody should read. It's freely available on the internet. About what do we do about the rise of Ralph Nader and consumerism and the civil rights movements? And he basically said, well, you got to break the unions. You've got to bring the news media to heel, like we're dogs, being told how to behave. And you have to undertake a series of other motions so that business can run the country. Most of his plan has been implemented. And so many people have no idea that they're pawns here who are being used. And we also now live in an era where there's a lot of denigrating of education. That doesn't surprise me because the median reading level, the median is half above, half below, for people 26 and older right now, is late fifth grade.
Wow. Basically,
half of Americans can only read at the level of a fifth grader or below. If you want to be generous, below a sixth grader. And 22%, more than 1 in 5, at the level of a third grader. You're 7 or 8 in third grade. So we have a very large share of our population who, they can read a stop sign, they can go to the supermarket and buy things off the shelf, but they can't analyze a news article, a simple basic news article. They are functionally literate, but in terms of comprehension, they're non-functional. And Trump preys on that. He says all the time, I love the poorly educated. Actually, he doesn't. He says, we love the poorly educated. He uses the royal we. We love the poorly educated. And frankly, they're so poorly educated, they don't understand that's an insult.
So if you were to say, okay, this is the messaging that I really think that Democrats need to kind of wrap their arms around and start speaking to it. I mean, should they start letting the firebrands that are coming up within the party really start to voice and be allowed kind of the limelight a little bit over?
The people who have been the most progressive are the ones doing the best in the elections. And I think that's because a lot of people have said, same old isn't working. The majority of the country is not going to get behind Zohran Mamdani, even if Mamdani turns out to be a really great mayor of New York and he's very successful. The minute you say socialist, people back up, even though we have socialist military, socialist police, socialist prosecutors, socialist fire departments, socialist roads. That word is a scare word to people.
Hot button.
What the Democrats have to do is two things, and I think that Republicans who are principled, and there are lots of principled Republicans, need to do, is have a two-part strategy. Part one is we got to stop this guy. He is damaging the country. He's making us less safe from bad actors overseas. and we need to investigate him, and particularly the Epstein files. After all, if it's a hoax and you're exonerated, why are you fighting so hard to keep them secret?
Correct.
But the second message, the one they really need, is here's what we're going to do to make your life better. And you can't do it the way Hillary Clinton did it, where she would say, well, here we have a 47-point plan, and if you'll look at page 15 on footnote number 3, Donald would get up and say, we're going to help you. I alone can save you. That's a visceral message that gets through to people. So real wages in 2021, the bottom 90% made less money than they did in 1973. And by the way, the ratio of incomes going to the top from 1970 to 2000, if you measured everybody in the 90% increase in income is 1 inch, how did the 1% of the 1% do? The oligarchs, people who own private jets, yachts, 62.5 feet. 1 inch to 62.5 feet. So each time one person got $1 here, these people each got $7,500. Well, fast forward another 2 decades to 2021, minus 1 inch over here, 2,356 feet, more than a half mile. The income pie in America has been getting bigger, but the slice going to the very high income group has been getting bigger and bigger, shrinking what's available to the rest of us. From 70 to 2000, the slice to the 10th of 1% went from 3% to about 11%, more than tripling. And the number of people who are paid for their job, over $50 million a year, it's been as high as 504 people in 2021. It usually runs 200 to 300. And their average income, and this is from their work for 1 year, their average income is over $100 million a year. So we have all sorts of people being paid $100 million a year for their work, some of them year after year after year. Now, after paying their taxes, they invest that money, and they have these unbelievable incomes way beyond anyone's ability to consume. I don't care what you want to do, you cannot consume an income. We have people like Larry Ellison, who now, through his son, controls a lot of our major news media, electronic media, and 2 movie studios out of 5. He, just in dividends from the Oracle Corporation, collects over $5 million a day for he and his family. I mean, he's divided his money up with estate planning, but the shares that he is called the beneficial owner of, more than $5 million a day. And yet we have many people like this who live virtually tax-free. If they don't get dividends, they can live virtually tax-free. Well, school teachers and police officers and real estate agents are heavily taxed.
So the messaging really needs to be able to come across. I mean, I think leading up to 2024 was not necessarily, we're doing all of these things for you, or your life is better, it has to be better, you have to acknowledge that it's better. That didn't really resonate well. It's certainly not resonating now.
And what's
how do we key in?
Yeah, Marsha, what's fascinating about that is, during Joe Biden's administration, we had record job growth.
Right.
We've never seen anything like that. People don't seem to recognize that. And even when you control for the dip from COVID, we still had record job growth.
Yes.
Well, in his first year in the second round, job creation under Trump was about 15,000 a month. Under Obama, after the Great Recession ended, so starting with March of 2010, over 200,000 jobs a month on average during Obama's presidency. Trump in a year didn't even create 1 month of what Obama did. And yet, lots of people believe that there's this economic nirvana. Now, that's all going to come home to them as the Iran war drives up oil prices and makes it hard to get fertilizer and other economic conditions unless he can shut it down right away. But the Democrats fundamentally need to have a real simple message. You know, we're going to see to it you have higher wages. And somebody says, how? You say, we're going to have more unions because unions mean higher pay. And they should be quoting Pope Francis. Without unions, there is no economic justice. I'm somebody who got premium pay because I got talent pay. but I got paid 6 days work for 5 days, 20% premium. It's not like I made 10 times what the average person in my group was paid. I got an extra 20%. Very few people have negotiating power. It's take it or leave it in most cases. And so the Democrats need to come back and say, we're going to set up systems that are going to raise pay to people. And when some small business owner says, well, I'll go broke, the answer should be, well, if you can't pay living wage, then maybe your business should go broke and other businesses will rise up. But pushing all these wages down is tearing the country apart. And we need to recognize that all societies have an obligation to those at the bottom of the pile. The Old Testament, Hammurabi's Code. I used to teach the law of the ancient world at Syracuse Law School for 15 years. All of the ancient societies all had rules to take care of the poor, to take care of the disabled, to take care of the sick, to take care of those who were orphaned or widowed. And we're diminishing that and cutting that and cutting that, while at the same time passing all sorts of rules and policies to redistribute money upwards. We've got to stop that. We've got to put an end to that.
So it's kind of stop talking about what they should be feeling and start talking about what they are actually
Yes, and then
feeling.
Here's why you want to be with us. I
right.
mean, yeah.
So watch what they do, not what they say. You're literally
The motto of
1,000 when it comes to predicting Trump's behavior.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, both Republicans and Democrats have been less than stellar in upholding their oaths and responsibilities. The Big Sheet, you wrote about your fears about how bad it could get. We've been talking for a while here. I'm kind of feeling like, have your fears been met or kind of exceeded at this point in terms of what you wrote then?
Well, I mean, I have a perfect track record on predicting things about Donald. I'm batting 1,000. On how the Republican leadership works in Congress, I'm batting under 100. I just could not imagine
Right.
back when I wrote the book you're referring to that came out in January of 2021 that congressional leadership would continue to just ignore their obligations under the Constitution, ignore the perquisites of their position, would not defend their institution. And this troubles me more than anything else. The failure of the Republican leadership in Congress to stand up to Trump about things that in private they're telling Democrats and friends and other people, we know this is wrong, but that's what Donald wants. You know, more than 1 million people died for this country. My father was 100% disabled veteran of the war. So under the law, I'm a war orphan. And you have people in office who were afraid to uphold their oath because they'll be voted out. That's despicable. I call these people Quisling Republicans. Quisling, for those who don't know the name, was the Nazi collaborator who was Prime Minister of Norway after the Nazis conquered Norway during World War II. And he was promptly tried and executed right after the war. But these are Quislings. They are traitors to their oath of office. They're damaging the country, and they're fraidy cats. And they deserve no respect. I think they should be shamed. I think people should engage in things like the few of them who have the courage to go to a town hall meeting, because most of them won't go to those anymore.
Right.
You know, organize people to go to it and have everybody stand up and turn their back on the person. You know, that's the
Shun
kind
them.
of peaceful protest, you know, shun these people. And on the way out the door, as you leave, say, you're a coward. You know, we don't need cowards. Vote in people with spine and integrity. Because I don't see any other way to do this but mocking these people and shaming them for their conduct.
Well, I love one of the points that you had written about in the epilogue for the book, The Big Cheat. My hope is that Trump's legacy is not more corruption and hatred, but a realization by the American people of how much Trumpism threatens our precious liberties. Democratic self-governance requires the citizenry to be engaged so that they elect those whose conduct displays confidence, dedication, respect for the law, and most of all, integrity, which I think at this point in time, second term, Not so much.
No, and Donald doesn't plan to leave the White House if he can find a way not to do it. He's not going to run again. He knows he can't do that. But remember, the only mistake he said he made, he said this in 2024, I never should have left the White House.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what more clear intention do you need from Donald about this? And no, things have gotten much worse. And on top of that, the Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, particularly the Governor McDonnell decision from Virginia, has basically legalized bribery. So if you're a senator and I want you to do something for David Cay Johnston Enterprises, and I go, as long as I don't say, well, I'll give you $1 million if you get this passed, that's a bribe. But if I say, I'd be really grateful if you can get this thing passed, and then I end up giving your grown daughter a Ferrari, Supreme Court says that's not a crime.
Right.
So all they've said is if you're not stupid, you can get away with extortion and bribery. And we really need to address this. We need to have integrity in government. And I, frankly, am willing to, I think we should have a debate about strict accountability. And one of the things when I taught the law of the ancient world, I taught my students was that when Athens, ancient Attica, was a democracy, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasury Secretary, in effect, who was picked by lot initially, if they couldn't account for all the books, you were supposed to be killed. That was the punishment. And so if I got appointed to that job and I'm not qualified for it, I would find somebody who is and pay them out of my salary to manage things so that the books are straight. Now, there's no evidence they actually went and killed people for things like this. But the point was you were held strictly accountable. And we need to have strict accountability. We need to have ways that people like Kristi Noem, who had these ads made about her to promote her that cost more than every movie that came out in 2025 except one, the F1 movie about car racing. None of them cost that much. Oppenheimer cost $100 million. Her ad project was $220, although they may have actually only paid out about $140, some of it so far. Clearly, this was just utter corruption, no bid contract with a front that didn't exist, and then the subcontractor is connected to her. That should be an automatic prosecution. And by the way, if Donald Trump's out of office in 2029, I expect that she's going to be indicted. She will be, if she is convicted, and she will get what she deserves, which is time behind bars.
And besides everything else that had happened in that department under her, that was the one thing that Donald Trump took issue with, was having the $220 million expenditure.
Well, what he actually
stated in...
He didn't actually object to the money. What he objected to was she said Donald knew about it and approved it. And that's exactly the kind of thing that would outrage Donald because he didn't have anything to do with it. He let her go do whatever she wants. You know, Donald does not pay attention to things. Barack Obama, according to his science advisor, John Holdren, when I interviewed him, was always saying, I want longer memos. The tradition in the White House is you give a 2-page memo. That's it. And he would say, no, I want more. In one case, he asked for 16 single-space pages. And he constantly was just absorbing information at night and personally sitting down with a stack of letters selected by the staff and handwriting back to people about their letters to the White House. Trump doesn't do anything like that. He wouldn't know how to understand these things to begin with. It's all a con.
So one of the things I definitely want to speak to today, you are doing a lecture, speaking event tomorrow at SUNY Brockport, which is steps you can take to restore democracy. It's tomorrow evening, Thursday the 26th. The doors open at 5:30. You start speaking at 6:30.
Right.
And then we'll have book signing after, books provided or able to be
probably
purchased
ahead of
through
time too.
Lethbridge.
I'll probably be. I'm going to be there early. I'll probably be signing books ahead of time. And if you've already bought any of my books, feel free to bring them. I'm happy to sign them.
So one of the things that I would love to hear from you is steps you can take to restore democracy right now as it relates to what we're going into in the 2026 midterms and then on to 2028. And how do we not have a third of the country apathetic about even getting to the polls?
So Marcia, the first step, and Tim Snyder, who wrote on tyranny, and is a student of this. Professor was at Yale now. He's at the University of Toronto. And Sarah Kendzior, who left journalism to get a doctoral degree in authoritarian studies, and others who've studied these fields. And I all agree that step one is you do not voluntarily submit to the tyrant. You don't go, okay, well, I guess I better just go along. That's step one. No. I differ with the others on the next couple of steps.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next thing is you make sure you are registered to vote. You check your status before elections to make sure that it hasn't been interfered with. That's not a problem in Monroe County, but in much of the country it is. You need to reach out to other people, your cousins, friends, people you knew in high school or college when you live somewhere else. Are you sure you're registered to vote? And then you need to get people to go to the polls. And one of the big efforts is to make it hard to vote. So Dodge City, Kansas, that is the iconic town of the Old West, where, by the way, when you arrived in town, there were signs everywhere that you had to take your guns and turn them over to the sheriff as long as you were in town, where people had this myth that everybody walked around with a 6-gun on their hip, which is nonsense. It's not at all how things work. They have one polling place, or they did in the last election. If you didn't own a car, you had to take the bus to the end of the line. You then had to walk a mile. You had to walk back a mile from the polling place, and you had to connect with the bus, which only ran every 1 or 2 hours. In other words, it was made almost impossible for you to go vote. That city is about 1/3 Hispanic. They're American citizens, but they're Hispanic culture. This was clearly designed to make sure that Hispanics, especially poor Hispanics, didn't vote. In Harris County, Texas, otherwise known as Metropolitan Houston, there is a single drop box. You may only drop off ballots for people who are in the car. It is not mathematically possible to drop several million ballots, even if cars pull up and immediately drop 4 ballots off and drive on, or 6 ballots. This is also done to make sure people don't vote. The Postal Service has just announced that we're not going to guarantee anymore that we will promptly stamp your mail, And so that means that when you have a whole bunch of ballots from an area you don't want to go forward, oh, well, put them over there, we'll get around to them, and you wait till after the election to cancel the postage. The U.S. Supreme Court just held that a black landlady in Texas who rented to white people whose mail wasn't coming to her or her tenants, and she was able to establish in trial proceedings that it was because 2 racist postal workers didn't approve of white people renting from a black person. What did the Supreme Court majority say? And I do not call them conservatives. They are not conservatives. They are radical anti-democrats, and a number of them, in my view, white supremacists. They said, well, you have no grounds for cause. You have no lawsuit to bring. If the post office didn't deliver your mail, too bad for you. Unbelievable, but it's indicative of the efforts by the 6-member majority to suppress votes, to help Trump. I mean, don't forget, the Chief Justice of the United States, John Glover Roberts, started his career as a lawyer, fresh out of I think it was Harvard Law, working in the Ronald Reagan Justice Department, and his job was to suppress the black vote. I mean, that's what they called it, but we know clearly from what's happened in records and things people have written since then that the unit he was in, their job was to reduce the number of black Americans who turn out to vote. And so, number 1, don't submit. But number 2 is you've got to get the vote out. Instead of buying TV ads, the Democrats should, which are incredibly expensive and move the needle 1/3 of a point at best. The Democrats should be putting money into having people walk door to door, having people on election day. So the third most important thing, in my view, is we need to get lawyers to take off election week. You need about 1 day's training if you're a practicing lawyer to understand the rudiments of election law in your state, and each state sets its own rules unless Congress votes to set national rules, which they haven't done. And so when people say, I was refused to vote, you can quickly answer questions, you can intervene, you can go in front of a judge. And by the way, if you're rejected at the poll, ask for a provisional ballot. That's a ballot that you will fill out. It will be recorded separately, and it will be decided later whether to count your vote. don't leave. Don't leave. If we do those things, then I think there's a very good chance that we will have leadership change in at least the House. I think that's highly likely to happen. It's also possible the Senate, and that would be very important because, of course, the Senate decides on confirming nominees. And as with all authoritarian regimes, Trump deliberately appoints unqualified people. You appoint people like Kristi Noem, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Mark Wayne Mullen to succeed Noem, Besant, the Treasury Secretary, because they are incompetent. Because you don't want the government to run well. You want people to be furious and angry at the government. And then you want to do your best you can to blame it on the opposition party. This is a consistent pattern with Franco in Spain and forgotten his name in Portugal, Salazar in Portugal, Mussolini, Hitler, Orban now in Hungary. It's a clear pattern you see everywhere. You're a dictator, you appoint family because you trust them, you appoint people economically dependent on you because you trust them, then you deliberately appoint incompetent people. And down the road, eventually, you have to enforce discipline as a dictator. So you will take out some of the people in your inner circle or your near outer circle to make people be afraid of you. And down the road of dictatorship, eventually, maybe not under Trump, but if we don't get our democracy back, there will be firing squads. And if I'm alive, I'm a high-level candidate for a firing squad. And I know that some people go, how can, what? If you go study authoritarian regimes, you will see that this is consistent. It doesn't matter if they're right-wing or left-wing or they're criminal. They all have to turn to these techniques to terrorize and discipline the population, including taking out their own followers. By the way, if you want to get a dark comedic take on this, there's a terrific film called The Death of Stalin with great acting. It's one of those movies worth watching twice, but it will tell you exactly how this works.
So none of this is hyperbolic speech.
I understand some people just they can't buy it. And here's what I'll say to that. I've written many stories in my career where people went, "Oh, that can't be true. The LAPD can't have officers undercover in Moscow and Havana." And then the police chief years later goes, "I even had officers undercover in Moscow and Havana." I have not been wrong once about Trump, and I've written things that took years for ultimate, absolutely irrefutable evidence to come out. But it always does, because I'm very careful. The reason Donald's never sued me is he knows he has no chance of ever getting anywhere because I'm so very careful with what I write about him.
You'd have to have a little bit of a deposition taking place with you.
I would enjoy that, but I would especially enjoy Donald in a deposition where I'm going to do the questioning, not the lawyers.
Right. So how do you feel as though this Supreme Court mail-in ballot issue that was heard on this past Monday?
Donald just voted by mail-in ballot. There was a by-election for the Florida State Representative District that includes Mar-a-Lago. Donald had won that district in 24 by about 11 points. A Democrat won it by a little more than 2. And that has to be weighing on Donald. But the hypocrisy here about mail-in voting. And look, lots of people are in nursing homes. They're not particularly well. They're not ambulatory. They don't own a car. Requiring people to go to the polls is ridiculous. Republicans have long been in support as a party of mail-in balloting, and there is exactly zero evidence that mail-in balloting is a system to cheat, as Donald claims. Local elections have all sorts of methods to make sure people who are not eligible to vote don't vote. And what did the Cato Institute, the libertarian ideology marketing group in Washington, find? Over a roughly 20-year period, they found 23 cases of illegal voting, of which I think 10 or fewer were non-citizens. And most of those were people who had a green card, and they thought wrongly that meant they were entitled to vote. You, by the way, often can vote if you're not a citizen in local elections, like school board elections. All you have to do is prove you live in the school district, and you're entitled to vote, whether you're a citizen or not. So they're going to do everything they can. And unfortunately, the post office has taken the position that we're no longer going to immediately cancel stamps and postmark them right away. And then we have this cockamamie Supreme Court decision that the Postal Service doesn't want to deliver your mail, even if it's for racist reasons. Tough luck to you, which is unbelievably offensive to the Constitution. So people should be leaning on their members of Congress to say, you need to make it clear that any postal officials who withhold mail or hold it back when we're back in power, you will be prosecuted.
So it's called be prepared and get involved.
Yeah,
Is
a good way to put it. Very good, Marcia.
2 ways. So tell me about the DC report. Is this something we can join or people
sure.
donate to?
Well, we hope they donate.
Okay.
My best friend, David Crook, we were reporters at the LA Times together, and he created eventually the most successful business publication in American history, the Wall Street Journal Sunday. Had a circulation 6 times larger than the Wall Street Journal itself for the 15 years it existed. David called me up the morning after the election results and said, the Washington Press Corps is not going to know how to cover this guy. And I said, yep, you're right. He said, we have to do something. And so we started DC Report. DC Report is nonprofit. It's a charity, so you can take a tax deduction if you're eligible, or you can give out of your donor advised fund, or if you're 70 and a half or older, out of your retirement funds. It is no advertising. We do have a mailing list, but we don't ever sell it or rent it out. Nobody else gets it. This is pure public service journalism. Most of us donate our articles. Over the 7 years that I was publisher, our average income was somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000 or $4,000 a month. We spent in a year, on average, less money than the New York Times spends every day covering the White House. Just the White House, not Washington, the White House. And yet we scooped the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and everybody else again and again and again. Our motto is covering what politicians do, not just what they say. Mm-hmm. Now, I gave up being publisher and turned it over to my friend Adam Leipzig. Adam Leipzig was for many years, a Disney studio executive. He was the genius behind a bunch of Robin Williams films like Dead Poets Society and Good Morning Vietnam. When he left to head National Geographic Pictures, he took a failed documentary, re-edited it, wrote a new script, and hired Morgan Freeman to narrate, and it became March of the Penguins, the second most successful documentary of all time. He also was my wife's boyfriend when I met him almost a half century ago. And anyway, Adam's Next Echo Foundation took over DC Report. They've been doing a terrific job. We have a whole bunch of contributors, and the contributors include former masthead editors at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, some people you've probably never heard of, academics. We publish a wide range of articles, but our focus is on what politicians do. So during the first Trump term, I and others broke numerous stories because while everybody's off covering what Trump said, we were reading the Federal Register. That's a document posted every day, sometimes runs 1,000 pages. It is the official government rule book, and the Federal Register is where the government says, well, we're going to change this rule, and here's how we propose to do it, or we're going to change how we implement this directive from Congress. And they have to reveal what they're going to do, they have to post the language, and then people get to comment. And a lot of things, nobody comments, or a handful of deeply interested parties, and occasionally you get 100,000 people who comment. And we would take those and IRS reports and Bureau of Labor Statistics reports and reports on worker safety, and we would make news about those because those are the things we think deserve attention. That there's negotiations going on between Democrats and Republicans on how to reconcile differences in House and Senate versions of a bill, I think is a lot less important than understanding how the government's actually operating. And so it's free. You can sign up to get alerts. I also do a couple times a week what we call reality check videos. They're less than 2 minutes because of some YouTube rule. and I tell you something you didn't know. My most recent one begins with my saying, well, I come today to praise Donald Trump for two things he's doing really well at. One of those two things is making America a pariah nation. But we've done numerous ones where we simply explain to you what the news means. And these are similar to sitting in my living room here. Every day of the week, I appear on overseas or domestic television shows as a commentator, mostly to explain what things mean. Why is this military strategy the way it is, or this diplomatic strategy, or what's the historic issue here? So it's something, I've spent my whole life doing this kind of work. When the New York Times hired me to see if there was a different way to write about taxes, the managing editor and I knew what we intended to do. The rest of the editors were like sort of in shock because it was not the way you usually do things. I covered the IRS without being in Washington. I did it from my home in Rochester, from living in airplanes, which I did 150 flight segments a year on average, and from the New York Times newsroom in New York. And we got a complete change in the way taxes are covered, just as I changed the way that gambling is covered. I changed the way casinos are covered, and some other things in my career where I went a different direction, and then people went, oh, that works pretty well. So DC Report, we don't necessarily post every day, but if you sign up for alerts, you'll get them, and you will know what we think is important for you to know to understand what's happening around us.
So not getting caught up into the visual, emotional aspect that you can get caught up in every single presser that is done with Donald Trump. The facts.
We don't go to press events. In fact, for the most of my career, the only press events I ever went to was about my story. Otherwise, I don't care. It's not the work that I do. I can find out what everybody else was told after the fact. So yeah, our focus very much is on, you wouldn't know this but for our work. And we don't expect you to always agree with us. I mean, every newspaper I've worked for, I've looked at the paper and gone both about news stories and editorials where the publisher's entitled to anything the publisher wants. That's the publisher's page. Gone, oh my God, or that's stupid or ridiculous or whatever. There's a reason we call it the first rough draft of history. What we hope people will do is at least think about the things we're telling you that you wouldn't know but for our work.
Excellent. So again, I want to make sure that people are well aware of the fact. Please join us tomorrow night, Thursday, the 26th, 5:30 doors open at SUNY Brockford. It is taking place in the Tower Fine Arts Center. David will be speaking at 6:30, doing book signings, and you can indeed come and hear more about the steps that need to be taken in order to restore democracy.
Right.
And please end up joining us tomorrow night in order to hear more.
Yeah, and this is sponsored by West Side Indivisible, which is one of a group of indivisible groups around the country. They are a nonprofit, and they're asking people, because they have to pay for insurance and police and all sorts of other stuff, people to leave $5 or more at the door.
Donation. And also by Knowledge in Action and Indivisible Outreach, all co-sponsoring. So we definitely invite you to join us because it will be extremely informative. So once again, I want to thank you, David Cay Johnston, for joining us and becoming so enlightening to me for everything that we just spoke of, or you were able to share with me today. If you'd like to contact David or DC Report, all that information is going to be available in our show notes. Thanks for joining us today. This is On the Go with the Glenn Advantage team, and I'm your host, once again, Marcia Glenn. Let the Glenn Advantage team become your advantage in the marketplace, and please go to On the Go with the Glenn Advantage team wherever you get your podcasts. Follow, like, and subscribe to the series. And we thank you for joining us today. And David, thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcia.